give their presentation from here, because that part of the session will also be streamed and available online. And then we will close the event, and then we'll have the conversation around the table. And that conversation will be introduced by State Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tore Hattrem. So we're fortunate to have him here as well. Now, the background for this session is that the EU is working busily, I guess, with its global strategy. And thanks to our conversation with Antonio and also with the EEAS, they have offered this very generous opportunity to come here to Norway, basically asking us how can we in Norway, but also together with the Nordic colleagues and the Baltic colleagues, provide input into that global strategy. And that's a very generous offer. It's hard to refuse that kind of offer. So we thank you so much for allowing us this opportunity. Now, the global strategy covers a lot of topics. Energy is just one part, but it's an important part. These days, the EU is also about to develop its European Energy Union. This year, according to the officials, this is a year of implementation for that energy union. The winter package was supposed to be presented yesterday, but probably will be presented next week. In the winter package, it will be a lot of specific proposals on dealing also with energy security, interconnections, diversity of supply, facilitation of LNGs, etc. And in the energy union package, there's also ideas about regional, the regional elements to the European Union. Because energy security is an issue that looks very differently and tastes differently. It depends upon where you stand. To be very frank, I think from Norway's view, energy security is not so much about security of supply, it's about security of demand. Is there somebody who would like to buy our energy, basically? That's our energy security concern. For the EU, it's about security of supply. But for some European countries, it's about reducing reliance on specific sources, for instance, Russian gas. For others, it's about reducing uncertainties related to transit countries, etc. So it's a very mixed picture. Today we will look at the energy situation, energy security situation in Northern Europe and the Baltic region in particular. And the key topic is how will the energy union, how will the global strategy impact on the security situation in this region. I think we've been very fortunate to gather a great group of people here. We have the directors and the leaders of research institutes from all over the Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, from Poland, and we have scholars from the UK and other places. We have people from government, but also people from companies. And we have a huge competence, I would say, around the table on energy security issues. As said, that this seminar is hosted jointly by the EU ISS and NUPI. We're very happy with this. And this is part of NUPI's effort also to strengthen our research on Europe and also to strengthen our cooperation with other partners in this region of Europe. So let me thank all of you for coming here. Thank you so much for attending the session. Let me also take this opportunity to thank in particular Gerald Stang from the EU ISS and Osman Velsin for doing their great job in organizing this, because events like this, they don't happen out of nothing. It's a lot of hard work. And also thanks to Pernille Riker, who tried to convince Antonio to go and come to NUPI, and that was great. So on that note, I'll just hand the floor to Antonio, please. And good luck. I really look forward to this. Thank you so much.
Okay. So good afternoon again, and I'm delighted to, should it be closer to, okay, closer to. Unfortunately, I also have spectacles, which probably doesn't help.
that better?
Much better. Thank you. So, good afternoon. I'm, of course, delighted that we managed to organize this event. As you see also, she was the first Norwegian visiting fellow at the then WISS when I was a research fellow, and I was a supervisor then, so you saw much time at least. And I'm and of course is part of a broad set of initiatives and beyond in these months that prepare the drafting of the EU global strategy on foreign security policy. The Vice President is expected to deliver both.
Sorry, technical problem.
Okay.
Let's just take this off. Sorry.
To deliver later this spring. This process that we have dubbed an expert outreach and consultation process all across the European Union sees the UISS involved alongside the EEAS, and we try to organize seminars on selected topics on the basis of a consensual agreement in virtually all the capitals and the member states. And we look forward to succeeding in doing that. There are still a couple of capitals that are not completely on board, but we count on being able to do that by Easter or shortly afterwards. This process, as piloted by the UISS and the EAS, will come to a provisional end in late April with the annual conference that the Institute organizes in Paris. The High Representative will be there, and that will probably be the occasion on which we'll illustrate in more detail the contents of the global strategy. If this is the process, of course, the outcome will be, in fact, as important. Normally, the High Representative says that the process is going to be as much important as the outcome. But of course, as you know all too well, these exercises do not take place in a vacuum. Events happening out there do influence the drafting of the paper. And of course, the member states and the EU institutions are all fully involved in the preparation of the document. Now, we have decided jointly to devote this event to energy security. I'm not an energy expert, of course, but let me just elaborate on a couple of points that are related to that. Energy security lies at the juncture of a number of issues that have gained a lot of traction in and for Europe over the past few years, in particular regarding the correlation, or the nexus, if you prefer, between the internal and the external dimension of the policy. Well, we had the first warning shots in 2006 and 2009 with the so-called gas wars between Ukraine and Russia that directly affected some EU member states. And then, of course, the big crisis in and over Ukraine, starting in late 2013, brought about disruption, but perhaps less than expected, and also generated sanctions that have affected also the energy security factor, among other things, by bringing to an end the South Stream project, and that is something that, as you know, still generates some bad blood inside the European Union and even across Europe. But there is also a wider picture that you have to take into account. One is, of course, technological innovation, and technology can be as disruptive as other events in this particular respect, normally for the better, but of course there could also be unintended consequences, such as the collapse of traditional oil producers in this respect that may have an impact on the global markets and the security of supply. The shale revolution in this respect is a sensitive case in point. And of course, conflict, and conflict in particular in the Middle East, or the wider Middle East, if you prefer, which has contributed to the drop in the price of crude oil over the past, the dramatic drop of the crude oil price over the past 12 months. A player like Saudi Arabia, of course, plays on both factors. On the one hand, keeping the price of oil low affects the competition coming from the shale revolution, and on the other hand, keeps down Iran and other competitors on the market. But of course, even in the case of Saudi Arabia, to some extent, there will be a moment of reckoning, which may be closer than expected. And we have this gigantic conflict that is not far from the borders of the European Union that some people now compare to the 30 Years' Wars. This terrible combination of territorial conflict, political conflict, and religious conflict that is affecting the country. Or other compare it to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where there was a sort of conflict by proxy in which all the major powers of the time were fighting against each other. There is the role of organized crime in all this. Let's not forget that until 1 or 2 years ago, we were all trying to fight piracy off the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden because that was disrupting the flow of energy, and in particular oil, to European markets. And of course, terrorism in itself. You may remember that a couple of years ago, you do certainly remember, there was a dramatic terrorist attack in Algeria perpetrated by Al-Qaeda that had an impact on international markets. And of course, I mean, I live in France. I can tell you that after the full implementation of the Vigipirate plan, there are patrols all around nuclear plants in France because there is also risk that terrorism could affect energy in that particular respect. The geopoliticization, or if you prefer, even the weaponization of energy and energy security is certainly not in the interest of the European Union. This combination of dependency and our style of action in foreign security policy makes us a very weak player in that particular domain. And as I said, it is not in our interest to play that kind of game. And if you listen to the Russian rhetoric, the arguments about the forthcoming resource wars in the 21st century, there is something to be concerned about that. There are also other players out there that are playing the sort of geopolitical game with energy. Thank God our Norwegian friends and allies behave differently, but they are probably the only ones at this very moment in the world. And what are the tools that the European Union can use to this effect? Well, without anticipating too much what might be in the end in the global strategy, I can tell you there will be a chapter on the EU as a security community. And this element of energy security will be part of that chapter. And there will be a very important chapter on building state and societal resilience in the countries all around the European Union. And of course, Ukraine is a relevant case in point. I don't know if it is my fault. There must be something electric on my body that is disrupting the energy flow coming to the microphones. But the European Union already has a number of tools to act in this particular domain. One is diplomacy, of course, and recently the success of the negotiation with Iran on the nuclear program is a good testing point. In terms of, and that is the typical external policy instruments. In terms of internal policy instruments, you know all too well that diversification is part of the energy mix that the European Union is suggesting the member states to implement. There is a very strong element of regulation that is also part of that. It's probably one of the most powerful tools we have vis-à-vis Gazprom, incidentally, and also allows us also to force Gazprom to negotiate on market terms rather than on geopolitical terms. There is the issue of connectivity, and it's not just connectivity outside, but also connectivity inside. The package will be revealed very, very soon. I understand that Commission's Vice President Šefčovič is in Norway today and tomorrow, and I think we'll already illustrate some of these elements to you. And one of the most intriguing things that will be unveiled is this idea of sub-regional connectivity, not just macro-regional, but also sub-regional, having groups of countries inside the EU that collaborate more closely with each other in order to exercise both connectivity and solidarity among themselves. Let me conclude by saying that, speaking in particular of solidarity, this is a time when internal European solidarity is being challenged, is being tested, be it in fiscal terms or when it comes to the refugees issues, and of course energy is probably part of that conversation. This is also a time when European citizens feel extremely insecure, although the sources of that insecurity vary enormously, whether you sit in Paris, you sit in Athens, you sit in Vilnius, or you sit in Spain. And you have to consider precisely that. There is a wide sense of insecurity, but the sources are different, and therefore the response must take into account the variety of that. But this is also a time, or the reason, if you prefer, why it will be extremely important for us today, and Julian will report back directly to Mogherini in this respect, to be able to come up with ideas that could allow us to claim success for the EU approach in this domain, energy security, where our vulnerabilities are most evident, I would say. The vulnerabilities of the European Union, not of Norway, but that is why we are also complementary in this respect. And without any further ado, I would wish you all a very, very fruitful seminar, and all the best for the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you so much.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank Ulf and Antonio and their colleagues for inviting to this discussion. I also want to thank NUPI for very positive cooperation in undertaking the project, the results of which I will briefly present to you. I think they address very well what Antonio mentioned in the end of his speech, talking about sub-regional cooperation. So we focus exactly on this type of cooperation and how it addresses energy security issues, which for some countries in the Baltic Sea region are of demand, for others, probably mostly others, are security of supply. Which one? Okay. What I would like to present during these 15 minutes that I have is what our study is about, without going into detail, and the things that I find myself most interesting and worth further analysis. You can see here the questions that we discussed, of all into the actual patterns of energy security related issues, such as trade in energy, mix of different energies in the Baltic Sea region states. And we looked in the period since enlargement of the EU, so more or less 10 years. The latest data available was 2012. So first of all, empirical, and what about evolving energy security situation in the Baltic Sea region. Then we looked into policy, regional, that is EU-wide, and cooperation, meaning intra-Nordic, intra-Baltic, Nordic-Baltic, Baltic-Polish, different formats, including BEMIP, Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan, contribute to increase security. In what ways can such types of cooperative action to energy security cooperation, and how they reduce, I personally see as the biggest issue in the... Okay. Antonio, you are not the only one. Even without glasses. Yes. Thank you. What I see as the major issue in the EU, but not only in the EU, in national policies as well, there is a huge gap between rhetoric and actual implementation when it comes to concrete measures of improving energy security. I think if we look into the history of European Union, energy policy, creating common energy market, creating common external energy policy, I would not be very original in characterizing it as a history of missed deadlines. The last quite famous one being 2014, when, according to the EU summit conclusions of February 2011, electricity and natural gas was supposed to be flowing freely inside the EU. So we are past 2014. It's definitely not the case that electricity and natural gas in the whole EU is flowing freely. So one of the main conclusions, as I will underline, of our study is that due to a number of reasons, it's much better to move ahead in formats of sub-regional cooperation inside EU among groups of countries rather than the whole EU 28. Our main argument is that policy coordination and sub-regional cooperation can affect the character of interdependencies in energy trade in several ways. It can help remove regulatory barriers by providing common rules. This is actually an issue which is often neglected, I think, compared to huge infrastructural projects. infrastructure projects attract much more political attention. They involve huge sums of money, usually EU funding, so they are much more visible in public debates. Regulatory issues are very technical, often very difficult to understand, but I would argue they are no less important, especially when there are already connections. It's regulatory environment that is crucial to allow trade in energy resources and increasing energy security. Common rules and resources to solve collective action problems. Another very important contribution of regional or sub-regional cooperation. I could give you a number of examples how BEMIP helped to solve collective action issues among Baltic countries which have been arguing about particular projects. Of course, it's not a solution of all problems. There are still issues which remain unresolved. For example, new nuclear power plant in Lithuania, which is the state of impasse, despite the fact that it is part of BEMIP. So BEMIP is not a miraculous instrument, but under certain conditions, it helps. And I will talk about these conditions in a moment. Dissemination of best practices. I think here we can definitely speak about Nordic countries' practices in creating electricity market and how Baltic states are now adopting the same Nord Pool model. I think this is a very good example of how also being in sub-region where also European Commission is involved through BEMIP helps to disseminate such practices into other parts of the sub-region, and we discussed this in our study as well. Why this is interesting from a scholarly, analytical point of view, I would say that Baltic states in particular, but not only, also Poland to some extent, and other countries, Finland in this region, are interesting to study because differently from France, Germany, regional cooperation, regional integration is not about radical shift of interdependencies. In the Baltic states case, it's most visible, shift from interdependence or actually pure dependence in some cases on Russia, supplies from Russia, into EU or EEA countries. European integration proceeded by managing interdependencies between already heavily interrelated countries. Here, it's a different case. Here, due to, first of all, security reasons, we have countries that have links, that have businesses already happening with Russia, which means there are interest groups which are favoring status quo. They benefit from the status quo, they benefit from trade in electricity, they benefit from trade in natural gas, which makes it an important opposing actor, important opposing force when we talk about diversification, introduction of competition, and so on. So this makes it much more challenging, I would argue, than simply managing already existing interdependencies in order to allow more competition and to benefit more from regional integration. So resistance of interest groups, I would say, is stronger, and that has been one reason why there has been such a huge gap between rhetoric and actual implementation of different so-called strategic projects in the Baltic states. BEMIP helped in advancing this. I would also argue that general economic policies are also important. If energy policy proposed differs radically from other economic policies, for example, external trade policy, then again, we don't have a big possibility that this will be implemented. The Nordic states, I think, again, are an example when their open economic policies were basically in line with energy policies and creation of open Nordic electricity market, for example. So this alignment is another important factor. Plus, a third important factor is the perception of threats by domestic political elites, which is also interrelated with advancement, with the effects of sub-regional cooperation and advancement of sub-regional projects. And changing security situation in the region again, Antonio already mentioned, some of these factors, I would say, changed threat perception in a number of these countries. And for example, LNG terminal in Lithuania, which actually moved ahead basically outside the BEMIP plan, was motivated mostly by perceived increase in a threat from the outside, threat of energy supply disruptions motivated by foreign policy reasons. So this is more or less the conceptual base of our analysis. And as I said, you have a text of the study. It is also available publicly on the web pages of our institute and NUPI, I suppose. So this is the outline of the first part, where we analyze actual energy security situation, trade in energy resources, energy mix in the Baltic Sea region countries. This is a table that summarizes this. Jakub is namely an author of this part of the study. So what I would just underline by showing this table without going into deeper comments is that, again, we see that different countries are in different situations what regards one of the 4 dimensions that we use in assessing energy security situation. This is nothing new. We can say the same about all EU 28 countries. They are characterized by different energy mixes, different energy resources, different partners in trade of energy resources. So this is a fact, and we have to acknowledge this fact. And again, this is an argument for the importance of sub-regional cooperation when groups of countries that have common issues and that could be that could find common interest to take advantage of different endowments, natural endowments, needs of energy supply, and other factors. They can proceed by taking into account these different mixes of energy sources and trading partners. Our second part of the study is focused on policy, regional and sub-regional cooperation. We discuss EU level decisions up to last year when we published our study, the developments on the EU level, which, as I said, have been much more about different summit declarations and different European Commission initiatives, which have been repackaged again and again with different names, the last one being European Energy Union, although it involves a lot of old things which have been not agreed by member states and not implemented. We discussed this, and then we moved to sub-regional initiatives, discussing various sub-regional initiatives among Nordic countries, which, as I said, could be regarded as best practices, and BEMIP, and how it worked in the case of Baltic Sea region countries. We compared sub-regional integration in trade in general with integration in energy sector specifically, by pointing out that integration in trade has been advanced much earlier and to a much larger extent compared to integration in energy sector. Energy market until recently remained fragmented both in the EU and in the Baltic Sea region countries. We discuss particular policies, instances of unilateral policy decisions made by Germany, for example, regarding nuclear energy, renewables, other decisions made by Poland. So I will not comment on this in detail. We look into experience of the 3 Baltic states. First 5 years of EU membership, when there were a lot of declarations but little happening on the ground in terms of actual advancement of energy projects, and then how Baltic Energy Market Interconnection Plan came into existence. What were the origins of this plan? I would say very important factor which accounts for this plan has been approaching deadline of the closure of Ignalina nuclear power plant in Lithuania, which mobilized Lithuanian political elites to start seriously looking for solutions to energy security issues and involving European Commission to make this not just a Lithuanian problem, but also common issue of the region, or at least sub-region. And how, with the initiative of BEMIP, how the situation changed, what is the current state of BEMIP projects. Again, we can state that situation in each of the Baltic states is different when it comes especially to natural gas. What concerns electricity, we are seeing increasing integration and quite encouraging progress made by now, especially with links between Swedlink and also Litpolink coming into functioning, which is happening now, actually. I think this will provide a very welcome push for the development of sub-regional electricity market, and Baltic states joining Nordic countries as part of an integrated market. And I hope Poland will also take advantage of this sub-regional electricity market. What concerns natural gas, as I said, situation is still different, with Latvia being behind in terms of regulatory alignment. But again, recent deal with Statoil, I think on better prices will provide a welcome push, closing the gap between energy security goal and goal of economic competitiveness. We had this debate in Lithuania to what extent LNG terminal is motivated purely by energy security reasons, to what extent it is an economically sound project. And for it to be economically sound, of course, we have to have competitive prices, and we need to have a bigger market so that terminal can serve not just Lithuanian or Estonian needs, but Latvian, maybe some Polish needs, and so on, taking into account, of course, other terminals and other competing sources. So I think recent deal with Statoil might be a positive step in this direction, which might also make Latvian authorities more interested in joining this trade network. So to conclude, as I said, countries of the Baltic Sea region are characterized by different mixes of energy sources of supply, also different political preferences, different perceptions of threats. This is reality. We have to acknowledge that. Therefore, it is particularly complicated to advance with the whole EU 28 countries in integrating energy markets and increasing energy security. We advocate sub-regional integration, as I said, as a way to move forward for those countries that have joint needs, common interests, and different natural endowments, of which they can take advantage as a group and share best practices in this respect. I should also note the decreasing importance of Russia as a supplier and increasing importance of Norway as a supplier of natural gas to this region, which is one of the observations from our empirical analysis. BEMIP shows how EU institutions can be helpful, can help solve collective action problems. Infrastructure projects are important, but removing regulatory barriers is equally important, and sometimes even more important than these big infrastructure projects. And BEMIP can serve as an example for other sub-regions of the EU. That's at least our conclusion, and I think could be also an interesting example to be applied in other sectors like transport or broadband that EU is also discussing, integrating, and has a number of new initiatives on the table. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Romanos. I think your presentation just published a book called The Liberal EU and Security Energy, a liberal actor in Norway, how Marxism and the Marxism can be used effectively to improve security. Now, we have the pleasure of having Susanna and Jakob, both Poles, but Susanna from Thyssen and Jakob from Newby, to say a few words about the EU gas game, two perspectives. Please.
Thank you. Of course, I would like to thank you and the organizers for inviting me to this great event. If I'm sharing this presentation with Jakub, it's simply because we had a common project, and it was a very fruitful project with a lot of interesting outcomes, which we would like to present during this short speech. So here is the broader perspective and results of this GoodGov project and the GoodGov energy work package, in which we analyzed two perspectives, the one of supplier and the one of importer of gas. Gas simply because this is an inherently geopolitical matter and problem. So we took into consideration a lot of institutional regulatory elements, also Ukraine conflict and some broader strategic context. So when we have a look at European gas balance, I suppose that most of you know already all this data, but simply we can see a decreasing consumption in the European Union, decreasing own production in the EU, as well as increasing imports from until 2010, and then a little bit decreasing imports of gas to European Union. Then when you have a look at gas suppliers, we've got insiders and outsiders in here, and two major players. This is, of course, Gazprom and Norway. What already was said by Ramunas, your observation about the tendency in the Baltics, it's confirmed in here for the whole European Union. The Russia gas exports to the European Union are decreasing a little bit, and at the same time, Statoil production and Statoil exports to the European Union are somewhat a little bit increasing recently. But we've got two major suppliers, and when we define security of gas supply, very often we think in terms of import share. So how much gas we are importing to the European Union, the share of the largest suppliers. And one more thing that we have to take into account is, of course, the availability of other gas suppliers. And there are not that many, as we saw it just before. There was a couple of other countries, insiders and outsiders. While studying security of gas supply to the European Union, we have to also take into account all elements that were already mentioned by Antonio Misiroli before. So all challenges, economical, political, geopolitical, rather mid-long-term perspective, elements that will influence the security of supply of gas supply to the European Union. It's about, of course, LNG and conventional gas, depletion of our own resources, some new discoveries, demand changes, crisis, international problems, etc., etc. One thing that is sure is that their impact on security of supply can be mitigated through tools that the European Union has developed throughout the years of cooperation or struggle with its major suppliers. And the European Union has, in fact, had until recently one EU toolbox with some direct tools and indirect tools. Among the direct ones, of course, the power of the EU as importer towards its suppliers, its attractivity of its market. So we have something to say in the European Union simply because we are importing so much gas. On the other hand, we had quite a limited mandate to act in the field of external EU energy policy. But what is sure, we had some indirect tools used for energy purposes that we used a lot while dealing with Gazprom and Statoil. It is about, of course, internal market, competition law, and our capacity to export and to promote our own rules abroad while dealing with other suppliers. In fact, the question was, in our project, the EU gas game is it time to redefine the rules of our cooperation with the others. So in fact, what we found out is that Commission Toolbox is very well functioning, and it's in place, and it works indiscriminately towards Gazprom or Statoil. We've got the same rules that we want to apply to any of our suppliers. But these rules will not be fully efficient as long as we don't have this internal market accomplished. This is the major problem and major challenge that the European Union has to face. And what I see as a problematic is that this toolbox addresses mainly economic and not political elements. Hence, the EU still is vulnerable to geopolitical events and is somehow obliged to find a way to deal with these problems. That's why we had this idea quite recently of an energy union. And very often I'm asked, what is it all about, this energy union? How is it new? For me, in fact, rules that we had in the European Union are exactly the same. It's just the narrative that changes, and we've got some new dynamics thanks to energy union. Before, we had mainly parallel energy discourses in the European Union. When you have a look at ULEX, there are more than 3,000 legal acts. We've got strategic thinking, strategy 2020, 2030, 2050, energy security strategy. All projects that were mentioned that we had here, BEMIP, but also EEPR, PCI, ESS, a lot of other interests, national preferences, Energiewende, French nuclear policy, all other countries having their own national interests. So at the very end, we had multiple messages with multiple voices without one strong coherence. We can debate whether the Polish proposal was a success or a failure. I think it will be another debate. But what is sure, it had a very good timing. It was a proper moment to bring this question to the broader public with elections in the European Union and, of course, the Ukrainian crisis. It was brought to the public attention because it was a simple, short text published in Financial Times. It was not a long, legal EU act. It was a very clear vision. It was Polish vision, of course, and strong own opinion. But as a matter of fact, it was controversial enough that it remained at the table. Have you ever heard of any other proposals brought by, the Baltics and also by the UK? The Polish proposal remained at the table and is still debated, and we can see that it is reflected, for example, in the SOS regulation proposal. So, of course, it had also a strong emphasis on security. That's how we came to this energy union. What we really have right now, I would say that we've got finally one continuous narrative, we've got one strong leader, we've got solid institutional structure, we've got a lot of transparency, and as for the European Union, a bit quicker decision-making chain. And it will be oversimplistic, but this is how I see the energy union. We've got all these elements inside that are rules of internal market. But the energy union, it's this external cogwheel that we can see outside of this. It might be nothing new, but still it gives a new dynamics and it is a new narrative. So we saw this power of importer EU toolbox. There was one thing that in fact changed thanks to the energy union. There we have this extended mandate to act in the field of external EU energy policy. So just to tell you my conclusion from this is that, in fact, you said that the European Union has no interest in playing geopolitical game. But for me, energy union is kind of a proof and expression of the fact that the EU has some kind of strategic thinking and hopes for the best while using rules of its internal market, but prepares for the worst while having this energy union. Thank you.
Thank you, and now it's my turn. And alluding to what Susanna has just said about preparing for the worst and hoping for the best, what one hopes is the best for one is not necessarily the best for the other one. And I now think, I will look into this other type of perspective, the one that is applied by suppliers of energy, in this specific case, gas to Europe. We see that we have two main gas suppliers, Russia, that is acting through its important instrument Gazprom, and Norway, that is also acting through its very important instrument Statoil. And we see that the positions of those two actors are slightly different. I'm not going to go through all this, through this whole list, but want only to point to the fact that Norway is in the EU debate defined as belonging, as being both insider and outsider. When we look at Norway from a kind of purely market-related terms, Norway is definitely an insider. Last week, EU has released new data on import dependence, and those data tell us a lot about the role of Norway. Because if we leave Norway outside of the EU, then the EU's energy import dependence is above 53%. When we include Norway, then the import dependence falls to 44%, and in terms of gas, having Norway on the inside really improves the situation dramatically. So this is also about perceptions of those two actors. We have to do with two countries and two actors that are viewed slightly differently in the European Union. Russia, that is suspected of having not only purely economic interests, but also some others, and Norway that has been framing its energy policy in purely economic terms. And when those two actors meet this energy union or the European Union, they have to adapt to those new changing circumstances. And we have seen a number of strategies on part of those two actors. Gazprom and Statoil do operate in the same international and regulatory environment, and they have adapted partly similar, partly different approaches. In the case of Gazprom, it was about enhancing gas resale in Western Europe. It was about adapting to regulatory standards of the European Union. We know that Gazprom was involved in this huge case. In the case of Norway, it was about liberalizing access to exploration licenses. It was about dismantling the Norwegian cartel for gas sales. It was about handling of Statoil's entry to Irish market, and it is also about adopting a much more flexible approach to the issue of pricing and availability. Adding to those two perspectives, one adopted by the importer and the other one by the exporter, we should also understand that energy is not only about purely economic means. And here I use the interpretative framework that was developed by Megan O'Sullivan in her very interesting article on the entanglement of energy grant strategy and international security. To put it shortly, energy is important to all countries that are somehow involved in the international game, and energy can be treated as one of the three things, as an end or an objective to be achieved. This is definitely the case of the European Union. Energy can be also used as a way or as a tool. We have also some ideas about how Russia is using its energy instruments in order to achieve some different goals. And energy can also be used as a means or a resource for national security strategies. And in the case of Norway, for instance, it's definitely that energy is being used in order to achieve some other goals than purely geopolitical ones. When we look at those two key actors, again, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but would only underline that in both cases we are talking about countries that earn a lot of money on selling their energy resources, and then there is also the issue of how do they spend those money that they earn. And we see, for instance, that in the case of Norway, defense spending are relatively low compared with Russia, that is almost very high. So when I look at energy resources in a kind of broader strategic context, and when I look at those two actors, I see two different things. And the key issue is how those money they earn on energy are being spent. In the case of Russia, we see that Russia has been earning a lot of money from selling its energy, mostly to the European Union. 70% of Russian gas exported goes to the European Union, more than 80% of Russian oil exported goes to the European Union, 50% of Russian coal being exported goes to the European Union. So European Union supplies is being supplied by Russia with energy, but supplies Russia with some economic means that are not necessarily spent on things we like. We have seen, for instance, a huge development in Russian military spendings. We have to bear in mind that 50% of Russia's budgetary revenue is generated from sales of oil and gas, and 20% of Russian budgetary spending goes to military sector. So we see a kind of link between, at least we have to see the link between those two. In the case of Norway, the revenue was somehow saved and put into this strategic fund that is to somehow secure the future of the Norwegian welfare system. We also have to add, for instance, that Norway belongs to the group of countries that spends most of money on helping other countries. This developmental aid issue is very high on the agenda, and it's also about spending some money that is earned on sales of gas for other purposes. So I think that it's important to understand that still, when we talk about energy, we should adopt a much broader approach to this issue. It's not only about economic interaction, it's also about strategic interaction. And we have gone through the list of assets that both the European Union has, and the way those who supply energy to the European Union have been adapting to those new circumstances. But I think that it's very important to have this strategic dimension in mind when talking about energy. And I think that I will stop now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And then we have the pleasure of having Emily Cox with us from the University of Sussex, and she's working. They have a group there working on around 20 people, and she's one of them. One of the people working on energy security.
Do I have some slides?
What happened?
Brilliant. So yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here. So yeah, I'm from the University of Sussex in UK, and I've been invited to talk a little bit about what energy security actually means. If you don't mind, I want to kind of open up this discussion a little bit and start talking about some conceptions of energy security, and obviously from there it follows how we actually measure it and how we ensure it. So yeah, just an introduction to myself. So my PhD was on energy security and carbon reduction. What we wanted to do was to try and create a framework for assessing low carbon transition plans in terms of their energy security. But I've also worked for the UK government on assessing the economic costs and social impacts of electricity shortfalls. And at the moment, I'm working on a project where we're going into the links between energy security and military security. And so we're looking at the nuclear power sector and nuclear submarines. So if anyone wants to talk about that, then please talk to me later. But yeah, I've been asked to talk about conceptions. And so just to go back, the reason I use this picture is because sometimes I think in energy policy making, it seems like energy security is a bit of a black box. You know, you get interests or ideas going in one side, they disappear into this thing called energy security. And then we get policies and recommendations popping out the other side without really much idea of what this black box actually is. And so here's some existing ideas of what energy security is. You'll probably all be aware of these. The first one, we've talked quite a lot today about reducing dependence on imports. This is probably the idea that started out the whole energy security discussion back in the 1970s. The Americans are still very, very keen on reducing their dependence on imports, and it's in a lot of their rhetoric, especially around developing shale gas. And obviously, we've got concerns with Russia and Ukraine. There's also concerns that countries such as China and Russia are starting to nationalize their energy industries. China's been pursuing bilateral trade agreements, which is seen by some as a way of trying to circumvent international norms. And so there's some concerns about this. The second one, which is very relevant to Europe is that it's all about ensuring that you've got enough capacity to meet your demand, right? And the reason this is relevant to Europe is because all of our infrastructure is getting really old. And power stations in an awful lot of European countries are closing faster than we're opening them. And so it's about saying, right, well, at the very least, you know, even before we get into this question of imports, it's about making sure you've got enough capacity to meet your demand. The third one is something that comes up in the media a lot, and it's this kind of bogeyman of, oh, well, what happens if the lights go out? And it's kind of seen as, you know, the worst possible case scenario that we could actually have some kind of electricity shortage. So in the UK, every single year, we get all of these stories in the media about how there's going to be blackouts because we don't have enough energy to meet our demand. Of course, the blackouts never actually happen, but what you often get is an awful lot of policies and recommendations coming out on the back of these stories. So on to the next one. So this is kind of linked to the imports argument. The idea is that it's not just about reducing dependence on imports, it's also about reducing dependence on resources per se. So for instance, one way that you could do that is to shift to renewables and reduce your reliance on all fossil fuels. Of course, the interesting thing about this is that there's then the flip side of it from the engineering community saying, well, renewables are terrible for your energy security because an awful lot of them are intermittent. As we've seen in Germany, as soon as you start getting an awful lot of intermittent renewables onto the system, you start getting some very weird things happening with the way that power markets work, which may well have some knock-on effects into energy security and investment further down the line. And the very last one is just a slightly more academic one, this one. So some conceptions now are actually trying to broaden out this energy security debate and saying that it's not just about securing supplies, it's also about economic security, so avoiding price volatility. And it's also about environmental security. And this is something that I wanted to interrogate with some of the stuff that I've been doing, because there's really a question of timescales here. You know, we're talking about energy security in the very short term or in the medium term. If we're talking about it in the long term, then maybe we need to start thinking about environmental impacts, because there's something that's going to come in the future. So the work that I want to very, very quickly present to you, basically I wanted to interrogate some of these, and so I came up with a set of 22 energy security indicators. I discussed them with stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders were from the UK energy sector. What's interesting is the way that I think an awful lot of their perceptions and an awful lot of their recommendations can actually be applied in other contexts. I'll talk about that in a little bit later. The idea was basically to find out what indicators and dimensions are felt to be most important, what are the underlying concepts used when justifying these choices, and I basically chose people on the basis of their involvement with organisations that have some impact on policy, whether through direct policy making or through participation in research, consultations, and so forth. So here's some of the quantitative results. So I literally just asked them to rank these things on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. I'm not going to go through all of these in loads of detail. There's a few that I really wanted to flag up. The first of all, I'm going to start closest to me. So the first of all, these ones on the left, these are all indicators relating to public acceptability. And as you can see, they've all got fairly high means, fairly low standard deviations. Basically, stakeholders generally thought that these are pretty important indicators of energy security. And we've kind of seen this quite a lot happening across Europe, nuclear power being the classic example of where public acceptability problems can really cause some quite massive impacts further down the line. The other ones, these 4 on the very far right-hand side, they've all got very high means, low standard deviations. People were in agreement that these are all really important, and they all relate to the flexibility of the system. So rather than securing availability, or some of the ones in the middle relate to affordability, these are all about how flexible your supply is. And so I've got here a proxy for flexibility of power supply, flexible demand, storage, interconnection, interconnectivity, which we've been talking about an awful lot today. And so these are really, as far as the people that I spoke to were concerned, these are what we need to be focusing on. The only other ones I just wanted to flag up were a couple of indicators of sustainability. Have I got a pointer? No, I don't know how it works. I don't want to turn it off. But so here we've got some indicators of sustainability, one of which being fuel depletion, which is often brought up as a long-term indicator of energy security. This had the lowest mean out of all of them. basically stakeholders really did not think that this is an issue. And what's often also brought up is, oh, well, it's not just about fuels, it's also about other materials, it's about metals, it's about rare earth elements. Again, really not on people's agenda as an important issue. The only sustainability one that people felt to be important was carbon emissions, but the interesting thing about that was that people aren't concerned about the physical impacts of climate change. The reason that they brought up carbon emissions was generally because of legislative and regulatory constraints, which these people really see as becoming a more important factor in the future, both in individual countries and at the EU level, and maybe, who knows, at the global level at some point. The other thing that this quantitative data showed, there's no alignment between the type of organisation for which people work and how they think about energy security. You would expect there to be some kind of patterns emerging. For instance, you'd expect environmental NGOs to be different from big energy suppliers. They're really not. There's no patterns whatsoever. And I think the reason for this was that all the people I spoke to are all fairly high up in their organisations. They've all got very complex, they've all got very nuanced opinions, which are gathered from a lot of different places that they might have worked at over their careers. And so, in a way, this is a really good thing, right? Because people aren't being co-opted by their party lines. But it also means that if you wanted to target something at a specific organisation or a specific type of organisation, according to this data, you may as well not bother. Just quickly, I want to go through some of the main themes that emerge. So these are some of the main things that people see as important when discussing energy security. The first one is there's massive disagreement over whether affordability and sustainability should be viewed as part of energy security. The stakeholders, especially on the affordability one, the stakeholders were pretty much split 50-50 down the middle. Some people think that affordability is absolutely critical, and some people think that it opens up too many second-order effects and that it overcomplicates the picture if you just want to talk about energy security. I'll mention that a little bit in the conclusions at the end as well. The second one, so you've got these traditional indicators of energy security, right? These being diversity, imports, trade volumes, also to some extent fuel depletion. These were ranked fairly low in general. They're not saying that imports and diversity aren't important, they're just saying that they're not the be-all and end-all. The problem with this is that there's a reason that trade volumes and diversity are used to measure energy security. It's because they're simple and they're quantifiable. You can create a diversity index. Trust me, you can do it in Excel. It takes like 30 seconds. You can measure trade volume with data from your National Customs Bureau, from national import-export data. They're very easy to do. Even fuel depletion, the IEA has data on fuel depletion, right? When you start looking at things like public acceptability, how on earth do you measure how acceptable a policy is going to be to the public? And the problem is that if you want to try and, for instance, compare energy security in different areas, in order to do this numerically, you need a number. And how do you put a number on something like public acceptability? So this is interesting, but it creates really big challenges for measuring energy security going forward. And with both of these, I think that conceptions are getting more complicated rather than less. The more we talk about this, the less people agree with each other and the more different factors they bring into the fold. The third one, again linked to this, I mean, how on earth do you measure economic and political feasibility? Of course, these are crucial. If you want secure energy, you need infrastructure. If you want infrastructure, you need investment. If you want investment, you need some sort of political feasibility. But again, you know, putting a measure on that is really challenging. Spatial and technological context are obviously really important. For instance, if you were to take an interconnector, located in one place, that interconnector could be really good for energy security. Locate it in the wrong place and it could be really bad. We have a particular problem in the UK where all of our interconnectors from Europe want to come into the Thames estuary. It's right next to London. The problem is then you can't build a high voltage cable all the way across London. So, you know, this is an example of how locating things in certain places might be great for security and in the wrong places not so much. Again, this brings up challenges because if you want to measure the security of an energy system or of multiple energy systems, and it's all to do with where you locate stuff, creating that generic framework is challenging. And the fifth one, which came up again and again, was that the demand side can bring really big co-benefits. And this is actually some other work that I've been doing actually corroborates this. Basically, demand reduction, overall energy demand reduction, is probably the single most beneficial policy for improving energy security in terms of bringing benefits in multiple different areas. I'm going to skip this a little bit because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but basically there were two different worldviews which emerged, one of which saying that important indicators are those which we have a normative imperative to address, because they represent a current or future risk. So public acceptability, we've got some quotes here from the fuel poverty indicator, which was really contentious, saying, you know, there's a moral argument, we need to do something about fuel poverty, you can't have a system where poor people can't afford to access. Then on the complete flip side of that, the other pretty much half of stakeholders said, no, these things aren't quantifiable, they aren't simple, they open it up to second order effects. And therefore, we can't include this because it just completely muddies the waters. And again, we've got quotes from the fuel poverty indicator saying, no, it's part of something different. You can't stretch energy security, saying it doesn't actually influence the politics of energy, even though it might be important because these people don't vote. So just to make some conclusions, I mean, the first one's kind of obvious, right? We need to open up this discussion. We need to accept the existence of multiple perspectives. We're not going to be able to get everyone to agree on what energy security means because people have been trying this for a really long time and it's getting more complicated rather than less. And so the only way around this is to understand the impact that taking another worldview could have on your ideas or your assessments, right? So for instance, say you want to say, right, how secure is this system? And you say, right, we don't want to include any affordability stuff in here because it's too complicated. That's fine, but you need to be explicit about that and you need to accept the difference that including, for instance, affordability indicators in there might have on the results of your assessment. As I said earlier, there's no alignment between experts' perspectives and the type of organisation for which they work. Which is quite interesting, and we're hoping to do a little bit more work, maybe with some bigger surveys to try and really flesh that out with some more quantitative data. We need to avoid focusing down on a small number of quantifiable metrics, which is easier said than done, because quantifiable metrics are nice and everyone likes them. But the point is that energy security is highly context-specific, as you all know. What this means is there's huge challenges in creating generalizable frameworks. And so we really need to interrogate what we're actually achieving. You know, there's loads of frameworks out there. The WEC has one, the EIA has one. There's all kinds of assessments of energy security. And what an awful lot of them do is they take a load of countries, apply a load of indicators, and then rank these countries in order. Now, not only are the results from these assessments normally completely different from each other, but they also don't capture things like, they don't capture the context-specific nature of it, and they don't capture the fact that important dimensions are actually probably not quantifiable at all. So we need to really think critically about what these are actually doing for us. I wanted to end on a positive note, right? Because this is all really complicated. Despite all of these complications, certain measures were widely suggested as being sensible for improving energy security across the board, no matter what your context. The first one is there's an awful lot of focus, and this is mainly referring to the academic literature, but also somewhat in policy. There's an awful lot of focus on minimizing causes of insecurity. So this was some work by some guys at Lund University, which basically found that we're always talking about minimizing causes of insecurity, minimizing risky imports being the classic example. But the results that I found here, and the results from other work that I've done as well, show that responding to insecurity can be just as important, and we really need to balance that out. So when I say responding to insecurity, I mean, for instance, increasing your flexibility. Measures such as storage and interconnection are classic ways of improving your ability to respond to insecurity. The idea is that threats and shocks are going to happen. They're probably going to be unpredictable. They're probably going to come out of nowhere. And the important thing is making sure that your system is flexible and resilient enough to deal with them. And that's something that I think we're all aware of, but the academic literature especially really hasn't caught up to that. The second one, as I said, measures which can bring co-benefits. Flexibility on both the supply side and the demand side does this to an extent, but as I said, the main one is really demand reduction, reduce your overall energy demand, and that brings benefits in all kinds of areas. And the very last one, and again, you'll all know this already, but we need to ensure that there's adequate investment in infrastructure. In order to do that, we need long-term planning, we need policy stability, and this is a problem in every single context that I've looked at, in that energy policy tends to be completely beholden to election cycles. And the problem is when you're trying to make long-term infrastructure plans over the very short timescales of politics, this is one of the main issues that can lead to insecurity. Again, how we go about creating that policy stability is, I hope, something that we can discuss maybe later this afternoon. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Cheers.